Ethical reasoning. In most ethical dilemmas, editors and reporters discuss the issue and the consequences of publication before making the decision. They consider how newsworthy the story is and whether the public really needs the information. Define the dilemma. Examine all your alternatives. Justify your decision. The Poynter Institute model. These are some more questions that you can ask to help journalists make decisions in ethical dilemmas. Code of ethics. Many news organizations have devised codes of ethics that govern the behavior of employees. These include policies about accepting gifts or freelance assignments, as well as guidelines about conflicts of interest. Staff members who violate these policies at newspapers can be fired, and many have been. In some cases, reporters have been fired for entering into business relationships with a source or using for personal gain information they get from sources. So this is a good chapter with lots of case studies and examples. And so we just briefly went over it, but I really want you to take the time and read it, examine it. There's a lot of good stuff and good stories in there. Chapter 16 is on multicultural sensitivity. Some coaching tips. Seek sources from different racial and ethnic backgrounds for all kinds of stories, not just stories about minorities. Ask your sources how they prefer to be addressed. Ask yourself if you would write the same type of description for a man as for a woman, for a white source as for a person of color, for a disabled person or member of any other ethnic or special group. We'll go over a few of the things in this chapter. National Association of Hispanic Journalists. The association has always denounced the use of the degrading terms alien and illegal alien to describe undocumented immigrants because it casts them as adverse, strange beings, inhuman outsiders who come to the US with questionable motivations. Even more objectionable to the association are headlines using the words illegals as a noun. Using the word in this way is grammatically incorrect and crosses the line by criminalizing the person, not the action that they are purported to have committed. Instead of terms such as illegal aliens or illegal immigrants used by many news media, the Association of Hispanic Journalists prefers the terms undocumented worker or undocumented immigrant. Acceptable variations include living in or entering a country illegally or without legal permission. As the population of the US continues to change, journalists and public relations practitioners need to be aware of such concerns about terminology and other issues in a multicultural society. By 2050, more than half the population in the country will be a mixture of Hispanics, Asians, and Blacks, with Hispanics making up nearly 29% of the residents, according to the US Census Bureau. The Asian American population will have the next largest increase, going from 5.1% to 9.2% of the population. The language of multiculturalism. Race is not the only issue creating confusion and consternation over language. Terms for gender, sexual orientation, religious affiliation, and nationality can all create negative interpretations among different groups. The US Census Bureau says that by 2023, half of all American children will be minorities. Gender neutral language. In 2013, Washington state passed a new law banning gender specific words in state laws. Nor is Washington alone. Several other states, California, Hawaii, Maryland, New York, Rhode Island, have gender neutral requirements for state documents, and other states are considering them. The trend to avoid using terms for gender or sexual orientation that might offend people isn't limited to states. If you are applying for a federal student loan, you don't need to specify mother and father. Parent 1 and parent 2 can substitute on the forms where the department is trying to establish the student's parents, regardless of marital status or gender. Gender neutral language involves only a fraction of the terms that can cause communication problems. And even when you think you are being sensitive, language preferences change. African American is the term preferred by many Blacks, but it is not accepted at all newspapers and television news organizations. Chicano is preferred by Mexican Americans in some parts of the country, yet it is offensive to many older members of the group. People of color is a term preferred by many organizations with a majority of non-white members. How can a journalist know the proper term to use? Any terms that might be acceptable today could be out of vogue tomorrow. The easiest solution is to ask how the source prefers to be addressed. Journalists have many other guides, starting with the Associated Press Style Book. In addition, groups representing various cultural and racial communities also have style guidebooks. Definitions of race. Racial identifiers. This is from Asian American Journalists Association. Had a problem with this headline: furniture coping with the Asian invasion. Asian invasion implies something ominous and dangerous. It also reinforces the bigoted belief, it continues to fester in some quarters of our society, that people of Asian descent are foreigners who are to be kept out at all costs. The remarks take on a racial overtone, with the implication being, well, this was an example. This was another example. Comments a radio station sports commentator made about Asian golfers, the U.S. Women's Golf Championship. The fact of the matter is that we have these kids named Kim, Park, and Lee out there. It's hard to tell one of these kids from the other for us who don't follow LPGA golf real closely. The association said the remarks take on a racial overtone, with the implication being, well, they all look alike anyway, don't they? Asia is a large continent with a diverse cross-section of cultures, languages, and physical characteristics. One could not imagine a sports columnist implying that all golfers from Europe are identical in appearance. We want to caution you on the use of the phrase yellow faces in describing Asian Americans. It is a misnomer and an outdated one at that. Asian Americans are not yellow-skinned after all. These are letters that they have had to write. It is not the only organization that offers a style guide for terms to improve sensitivity to a racial group. The National Association of Black Journalists also offers a style book as a resource. When referring to African Americans, the association says African, African American, and Black are acceptable, but it adds, not all Black people are African Americans if they were born outside of the United States. Let a subject's preference determine which term to use. In a story in which race is relevant and there is no stated preference for an individual or individuals, use Black because it is an accurate description of race. Do not use race in a police description unless the report is highly detailed and gives more than just the person's skin color. Use Black as an adjective, not a noun. When describing a group, use Black people instead of just Blacks. In headlines, Blacks, however, is acceptable. The term people of color is also acceptable as a synonym for minorities. Ethical dilemma. So this photo was taken of the celebration at the end of a 3-day conference of the Black student government at the University of Kansas and published in the student newspaper. African-American students at the university complained. Why? Do you think there is anything insensitive about this photo? This was the photo. Okay. Now, the photos were of African Americans dancing and singing. On the sports page that same day, 5 African American athletes were pictured. Those were the only photos of African Americans in that issue. Dancing, singing, and slam dunking. These are too often the only images of African Americans that newspapers provide to their readers. I or someone else in the newsroom should have realized before the